In this video, I'd like to talk briefly about the toxicity of different materials in art. Now, some toxic substances are very obvious. When I'm painting in oil, I use a product called a terpenoid natural, which is a citrus-based replacement for turpentine, which is more toxic. And because it's obviously called terpenoid natural and it comes in a can with leaves on it and stuff, you can tell that it's a natural alternative to a toxic substance. So many times you can, no matter what type of medium you're working in, you can tell or find a natural replacement for a substance that is obviously toxic. Specifically in this video, I want to talk about graphite drawing or pencil drawing, metal point drawing, and then ink. And in my case, these are acrylic inks. Now, you would think out of those three things that perhaps graphite is the safest because it's our basic number 2 pencil that everyone from school children to the elderly can use fairly safely. It's usually encased in wood, although I do have pure graphite sticks. So that's graphite, and it is just about the safest material out of these. Graphite, though, was originally used as a pigment for ink. It was mixed with other things and it was used for ink, and it's actually a pigment that comes out of the earth. So in a sense, when you're drawing in graphite, you're drawing in dirt or with dirt, with a mineral that's found in dirt. And ages ago they used to mix it. I'm not sure if they used resins or just water, but they made it into an ink. Now the next thing you see here is currently I've been doing some pewter drawings. Now pewter is made up of tin, copper, and antimony. Those are 3 heavy metals. It was also formerly it also included in the past lead. And I was researching different metals this evening, and I went to Wikipedia and on heavy metals and learned something that I hadn't known before. And it has nothing to do with art, but it's an example of why you need to be very careful what materials you're using. From, I think they said 1960-something to 1970-something, most cars used leaded gasoline. And lead was in the gasoline. Well, due to runoff at gas stations, due to exhaust, due to the fact that a lot of people kept a gallon of gas in their garage. In other words, the lead from the gasoline got into everything. Our atmosphere, in the vapors, it would then fall to the ground, get absorbed into the soil. And recently I've been looking into drawing turtles. The way that turtles live, they bury into the soil. So many turtles could have lead poisoning because of the way they live. And because our gasoline went down into the soil. It would depend on the location and all of that. But the other thing that was interesting in the page at Wikipedia, and I'll put the link for that page in the information section, was that studies saw a dramatic rise in violence in young people when we were using leaded gasoline. So lead poisoning can be in places you don't expect it to be. Now, how does that relate to metal point? Well, you have to do your research on any metal that you're thinking of using for drawing. I have, and I've mentioned this in another video, I have a pewter stylus. Most pewter now does not have lead, but the ingredients of this piece wasn't told to me. So this could have lead in it and I wouldn't know it. I should be using gloves if I'm going to draw with this all the time. Otherwise, my skin is going to absorb the lead, the tin. And you think lead is the worst. Copper, tin, and antimony are all heavy metals that will cause brain damage or cancer. So you have to be careful. This is pewter wire that I've put into a holder. I just cut up a dowel, drilled a hole, and put the wire in there and glued it in. If you're going to work in metal, that's how you should do it, or you should wear gloves. Now, I've drawn with different metal items such as earrings, bracelets, coins, keys. You can draw with a lot of different metal things, but you should have a general idea of what the metal is, and if you're going to use it all the time, you need to be aware of the toxicity levels. Now, here's another thought. I have about 50 or 60 metal point drawings from the last few years. If I were to hang those on my walls in, say, one room or studio, all of those metals are oxidizing. And when they oxidize, they interact with my atmosphere. I would be, if I displayed them all at the same time without being under glass, I would be polluting my own environment. So there are a lot of things to consider when you're using art materials in general, but especially metal point. So that brings me to pen and ink, which I have done for many years. Now, what ink has, some inks have solvents in them, which would maybe be toxic. But generally, because of the type of drawing you're doing, you want to keep the paper clean. You don't want ink blots everywhere. I would think that generally people are more careful with ink. I tend to get covered with whatever I'm working in. I have rags that are covered with ink. My clothes get covered with ink. But ink is basically a polymer and pigments to this type of ink, this type of artist ink. There are thousands of types of inks on the market, and those meant for fountain pens are going to be very different from those meant for technical pens or waterproof drawing. And it's the waterproof capability that brings in usually a polymer or an acrylic in order so that when the ink dries, it's more waterproof and the pigment is sealed. Now, out of the three, graphite with, now this one has color pencil on it. Prismacolor pencils are pigment and polymer, I believe. If they're not polymer, they're wax. So again, what both of those things would do is adhere the pigment, the graphite, or the color down to the paper. The metal point tends to smudge and shift as much as graphite would if it weren't layered with color, a polymer or a wax color pencil on top of it. Plain graphite will smudge almost as much as metal point. Now, ink, once it dries, is really permanent. I could take this piece that I'm working on and I could soak it in a tray of water and the ink wouldn't move around. So that's a great thing. It makes a permanent piece of work that is fairly non-toxic unless you eat it or you keep it on your hands and don't wash your hands, anything like that. So out of these three, even though graphite is something that we let our kids use, out of these three, I would say that the ink is probably safer even than the graphite. Graphite is a powder, and it's held in place with a wood casing, but it's a dust, a powder, a pigment. It's a raw pigment. And as such, you know, we walk around with pencil smudges all over our hands and don't think twice about it. It's a very fine powder, and you have to consider that even if it's generally non-toxic, you don't want to be breathing graphite all the time. So you have to make your own decisions, but out of the three right here, graphite, metal point, or acrylic ink, as long as the ink is used according to the instructions with a technical pen, I think it's as safe, if not maybe a little bit safer, than graphite. Now, most art materials, if not all, have to have a rating on them for toxicity. And I'm just looking, I think they have to be, anything meant for children has to meet certain standards. This is not marked that it meets those standards. This is sap green, opaque, permanent, and it doesn't have the ingredients. So in order to really find out what's in here, I'd have to go to Dale Arowney website and look up the Material Safety Data Sheet, MSDS, on this particular product. But I would probably find out it has some kind of an acrylic or a polymer ingredient. I would be most concerned to find out the solvent. So maybe I have to correct myself a little bit, and I wouldn't maybe give it to children then, because it doesn't say that it meets those standards. Unless the child was going to use it in a technical pen and not stick the thing in their mouth or something like that. So it would be age appropriate. Graphite, in many ways, is considered safer than, simply because it stays down on the paper and it's not a liquid. Maybe that's it. But I wouldn't want to be breathing graphite all the time. So this is just 3 little examples of different ways that you can run into a toxic substance in artwork. And with all of them, you should research anything you're going to use all the time and wear gloves or a dust mask, a face mask, if appropriate.